Delighted to welcome you this morning for, I think this is, Vishal, the 8th edition or 9th? This is the 8th edition of our post-budget event, which is held at Gokhale Institute and in partnership with at least 5 or 4 different organizations. Pune International Centre, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, National Institute of Bank Management, India Development Foundation. So we are continuing this tradition, and we of course have a very stellar panel, as Dr. Vishal mentioned and described their bios to you. My job is to sort of get the flight off the ground. So I'll make a few preliminary announcements, like please tighten your seat belt and be comfortable. I have already requested my panelists to confine their comments each, because the budget is a vast subject and there's a lot to say, but we want to leave enough time for an interaction with you all. I think the backdrop to this budget were 3 things. One is the macroeconomic context in the world, the context of the world itself. The world is undergoing a recession. Okay. On top of the recession, there is also this Ukraine war, which seems to be endless. On February 24, it will enter into the 2nd year. The US is already sending tanks. Some people, sort of kind of I don't know, sarcastically, or they have said the US will fight this war until the last Ukrainian. But that was, it was kind of a... So this war, we don't know how it's going and where it's going. But what it has done is it has created a lot of disruptions. It has created a huge inflationary spike in the prices of crude oil and also food prices. Not only wheat, but even rice price of, other food commodities have gone up. And that is impacting people all around the world, in countries in Africa, countries in East Asia, countries like India. So the inflationary impact of the war and the impact of shortages is being felt. So that, and of course, because of the recessionary environment, the outlook for capital flows, which India is dependent on, or export prospects are that much weaker. So this is the first macro context. The second macro context, according to me, in context to the budget, is that India has been undergoing a good recovery. We had something like, say, I don't know, 7% growth, and next year is maybe 6%. But this growth seems to be uneven because it is benefiting people at the higher end of expenditures much more than at the lower end. For example, Mercedes cars growth sales record last year in 2022 was 41% growth. I think Lamborghini also, which is a car which I don't think most people buy, they had record sales growth in India. Most of the luxury cars are booming, but two-wheeler sales of two-wheelers, scooters and so on, they have been declining for 3 years in a row. If you look at consumer staples, that is also stagnating. So this is what is called a K-shaped recovery. There's the upper part of the K and lower part of the K. Most of the population is in the lower part. So the upper part of the K, which is luxury cars, flats, just this morning I read in the Times of India that in Mumbai, how many flats is it? 1,200 crores in one building. I think 20 flats, I don't know, were sold in one go. Worth 1,200 crores. So luxury cars, real estate, airline travel, 5-star hotels, tourism, that is really booming. Outbound travel, even the stock market. Again, who is invested in the stock market? People who have money or who have savings. Only 3% of India is invested in the stock market, and so that perhaps that part of the economy is doing well, and that's reflected in the high growth rate. But is it benefiting the, is it evenly spread? Is it equitable? So that's the second macro context. First is global recessionary environment. Second is the uneven growth, the K-shaped recovery, which I think is in the 3rd year. And the third context, of course, is the fiscal situation. India is a very, even though our population is young and we sometimes don't seem to worry about the fiscal deficit is high. But if you look at it in the context of how much we are paying for interest payments and how much of the revenue of the government simply goes to pay interest on the debt, and the debt is mounting, it's a very worrying situation. So the finance minister had to do a very tough balancing act. In the first case, provide resilience to against global recession. In the second case, to provide some kind of redistribution and relief to the lower part of the K. And in the third part, to tighten the belt and have some fiscal consolidation.
I have not seen this kind of hype and hoopla about budget in any other country. So I think that the fact that budget has become media event speaks something of us, because you don't expect, end of the day, budget, as Dr. Ranade rightly said, is an income expenditure statement of the government. When it comes to policy, you don't need that the policy has to wait on a Shubh Muhurtam on February the 1st to have it announced. The policies can happen throughout the year. So I believe this is more of the kind of royalty speaking to the subjects on various things. It almost takes that kind of a shape. So Dr. Ranade has rightly said about the macro context of the budget. The one was definitely the global recession was on. Secondly, of course, we know there has been a K-shaped recovery, fiscal deficit. The other thing is definitely the inflationary concern, and almost synchronized rate hikes by central banks of the G7 countries, at least the 4 major central banks. So these were the context in which finance minister was making the budget. And one of the primary things that comes in also, this is an election year. So I would presume that lots of people expected lots of populism. The perception is the finance minister has avoided that sort of route, or we'll analyze is it. And in that context, there has been no major bad news. That itself is a good news in an election year. Now, in terms of macro numbers, if you look at it, India's GDP has been remarkably well by global standards. They have, in fact, it is in the latest IMF report of January 27th, it is actually the fastest growing economy in the world compared to any other countries. And therefore, of course, in the presence of global headwinds, Russian invasion, rate hikes, capital outflow, inflation, and K-shaped recovery, this itself is a good news. Now, of course, the growth has been uneven, and there has been pointed out, ours has been primarily a services sector growth. Now, apart from that, what has been the major macro context of the budget? In terms of savings and investment, Indian economy has been doing badly till about, we have the firm numbers, till about 2021. There's almost a secular decline. Even if you forget the COVID year, the savings and investment both have been coming down. These are the macro context. We need to see how far the budget has been, essentially been right in that direction. Now, therefore, the basic macro features, next please. Yeah. The basic macro features that you get to see, that the inflation rate still RBI projects 6.8% in financial year 22-23, which is itself outside the target range. Budget has, and the economic survey has legitimately claimed that the migrant workers have returned to the construction activities. There has been some surge in exports in financial year 22-23, which we are not too sure whether this is going to continue later. Private consumption went up. It also points out the lower foreign trade prospects globally. Next, please. So in this context, the budget has said about 7 priorities: inclusive development, reaching the last mile, infrastructure and investment, green growth, unleashing the potential, youth power, and financial sector. The things that are positives in the budget. Definitely there has been very impressive increase in capital expenditure, which is at 3.3% on nominal GDP for the first time. And if you add the grants in aid, it becomes 4.5%. These are impressive numbers. The new tax regime has been made the default regime, and essentially for the middle class, there have been some SOPs with income up to 7 lakhs. They need not have to pay any income taxes. There are some specific saving schemes, the Mahila Samman Saving Certificate, and as well as the hike in the maximum deposits limit of the senior citizen scheme. And there has been the right kind of mention of various sectors like digital economy, green economy, bioagro resources, or scaling. And all this happens while maintaining the fiscal deficit at 5.9%, and financial markets have tend to sort of encourage it. They at least on that particular day, despite the other bad news that's going on, the financial markets give some positive signals. Of course, next one. Some concerns remain. The informal sector, I don't think there has been touched that much. There has been an assertion in terms of increase in formalization, in terms of indicators like the adoption of UPI or subscription to EPFO. The rise of inflation needs further attention. The economic survey, not in the budget, economic survey is somewhat apologetic in terms of startups leaving the country. We all hear India has been a really, a land of the startups. And that they ascribe this in the phenomenon of flipping, which is a process, and I quote, transferring the entire ownership of an Indian company to an overseas entity, accompanied by a transfer of all IP and data owned by the Indian company. This notion of flipping, this phenomenon of flipping, is somewhat surprising given the fact we had very impressive numbers in terms of World Bank doing business indicators. Let me come to the basic fiscal arithmetic. In terms of fiscal arithmetic, one is really, as I pointed out, I have taken both in terms of percent of GDP as well as the composition. There has been indeed been an impressive record in terms of the deficit numbers, and that too in an election year in deficit number. Therefore, we thought one should look deeper. When the deficit numbers is unchanged, you need to seek at least either the revenue has gone up or expenditure have come down, or perhaps both. So in order to look at that, I sort of try to see is where does the added capital expenditure it comes from. So next please. So if you look at the added, there has been huge reduction in the central sector schemes. I mean, in terms of central sector schemes revenue expenditure, the number that I've arrived at is something like a reduction of 1,37,000 crore. That's a major reduction in central sector schemes. So what it does essentially in terms of, are we seeing some kind of creative accounting? Are we seeing something like fiscal, at least the central sector schemes have been suffering to that extent? But my reading of the budget is, what was earlier was purely seen as grants in aid in terms of revenue budget has been shifted to kind of interest-free loan, long-term interest-free loan with bullet payments. As a result of which you say an increase in capital expenditure, but at the same time your revenue deficit is under control. Therefore, in some way, will the devil lie in detail? Next one. So I'll end this. I was looking at least one interview by former Chief Statistician Pranab Sen, who sort of pointed out that this increase in 33% increase in capital investment to around 10 lakh crores, amounting to 3.3%, there could be elements of creativity there. Why? A substantial part of this increase has happened by reducing the capex of PSUs. It could be 1.3 lakh crore to the states on a 50-year loan. May not be an increase in capex, but simply a change in the source of funding from earlier the grants to the current capex. And earlier even the grants, the center was dictating the states. Now even in terms of the capex, these will be somewhat tied.
Budget is a very strange melange of Shakespeare plays, right? From Midsummer Night Dream to Hamlet. You have all shades there because you are talking of both past, present challenges and future together. I'm going to talk about some things which probably are not in line with what we have been discussing so far. Firstly, I don't think this ratio to GDP makes sense. I have said this even before. It is better to have it straight away to what your revenue earning capacity has been, because that effectively signals how much saving you are tapping for meeting your revenue deficit, which is the primary concern. capex is something which anyway is, government happens to be a borrower to whom the banks cannot deny and RBI cannot deny. So anyway, that will somehow be funded. So it is better to in fact look at this, and there is a reason why I am reiterating this. There are many signals in terms of pronouncements and the even advertisement like pronouncements that have been made, which are significant to in fact doubt our GDP numbers. The kind of resilience that we have shown, both in terms of tempering the nature of inflationary pressure experienced elsewhere as against ours, in spite of rise in some of the petroleum products later when they were slashed initially and then raised again, I think this GDP business is lacking something. It is missing something very significant, as a result of which you get the numbers which probably would be even more optimistic if the missed GDP is included in this. Secondly, like I'll just give you one example. The number of crop cutting experiments that were reported to have been conducted for the purposes of agricultural insurance, if they are incorporated in agricultural value added, I'm pretty sure that our agricultural value added figures will get revised. Secondly, there is also a claim which says nearly 2 lakh crores were distributed among 11 crore farmers every year, which effectively amounts to 1,500 rupees per month per farmer, which is being transmitted. Even believing that there is, like our pharmaceutical approval cutoff rate of 50%, even 50% is true, this is a significant amount. And that probably, again, does not get necessarily reflected in our mechanism, established mechanism of estimation of consumption expenditure. By and large, this is also a problem of what is often called as unregistered sector activity across all sectors in CSO parlance. So I think for institutions like Gokhale Institute, these are the kind of points and the reflections which are or data that are showed in the budget. Like for example, 48 crores Janadhan accounts. What is happening to that? It's something which is a worthwhile activity to look at, because in the pandemic period, every alternate month, if it was a Janadhan account held by a woman, then it used to be credited for 500 rupees. So please also pay attention to the GDP number that we so fondly use in taking it as a ratio to whatever government does. The numbers of the expenditure and receipts are more realistic than the GDP numbers. So unless we are comparing with someone else, maybe across nations or sometimes across states, taking a ratio to GDP by itself does not serve purpose, because everyone knows that the entire GDP does not get covered under the tax net. So this is as far as the usual ritual statistic of the budget is concerned. There are a number of other things. The most worrying thing for the last decade or so has been stagnation in private investment. We have to really explore, has it something to do with the nature of borrowing program which the government has? Because with government borrowing at a almost pre-negotiated fixed rate, and banks having a comfortable interest income position on their balance sheet to earn that, probably does not provide enough push or incentive for the banks to look for which investment they should be funding from coming from private sector. This is another way of looking at what we otherwise call as crowding out effect, because the government borrows heavily and the banks are comfortable with what government borrowings are providing, then probably their drive for searching for better customer to have loans is likely to be subdued. Keep aside all these factors. Let us look at one sector which Kavita referred to. One is education. Because there are a number of schemes, like every year the new schemes or the old schemes revised and decorated differently are often presented in the budget. There are two striking things. One is there is a talk about AI getting a push on the one hand, and secondly there is also talk about restructuring the erstwhile scheme that was declared as a skill development scheme, Skilling India program. Obviously it was not so well conceptualized program, nearly 10,000 crores allocated for that, but the institutional agencies that were available at the disposal of the government, and please note it is not only union government but also state governments, there are ITIs were in fact one of the backbone of this entire program, and one knows what kind of a dilapidated state the ITIs have. Therefore they were the most inappropriate institutions to run this kind of a program. Thankfully, government now admits that, and it says that probably there is a mismatch of skills, then what is demanded, what is supplied, those who are going to be potential employers should give a feedback. I think government should also consider the possibility of using some other institutional arrangement that are available with both state government as well as the union government, namely educational institutions, particularly those which are serving education or giving education after 10th standard onwards, and blend them with a program something like NCC camps do, because even an NCC-like structure is capable of imparting many skills to a sector which is, strictly speaking, is often not perceived as the union government sector, namely agriculture, which is not so, because union government has a huge presence in agriculture, particularly in form of what we call the administration of minimum support price mechanism under the mechanism of the FCI procurement. Simultaneously, the both survey as well as the budget talks about another program, which is in fact the millet program, which I think is a very welcome recognition. But there are two reforms which are needed if any such kind of a thing was to be achieved. Firstly, Food Corporation of India, if you look at its entire procurement mechanism for several decades now, it is heavily concentrated in favor of only 3 states. Consequently, all other remaining states remain deprived of possibility of having either an infrastructure or the benefit whatsoever that they emerge from the MSP-like scheme. If you consider this in the context of millet program, in fact, good part of the millet program, it is probably impossible to implement across India. And it is also not likely to be perhaps possible in context of specific crops, because they are grown only in certain small regions even of a state, forget about nation. If this millet program also starts getting a component, so first thing, I think 3 things that are needed in this case, because that something concerns the subsidy component of the food expenditure which union government budget has, running the so-called PDS and the FCI operations. Firstly, it is better to declare what we call in WTO parlance blue box subsidy for Punjab and Haryana. Give subsidy for not cultivating certain crops, which also has huge amount of environmental implication. Secondly, redirect the procurement you otherwise make from these 3 most favored kind of states when it comes to procurement to other states, so that the other states start looking at how to reorganize their agriculture procurement, and more or less now abundant kind of structures that exist in state warehousing corporation, Maharashtra included.
I say it is irrelevant because of the various things that has already been said about being budgeted for but not being spent. But also, if you look at the speech was a really short speech. But what was even more surprising and pleasantly so is the division between the Part A and the Part B. Part A was about an hour, Part B was about 10 or 15 minutes. But Part B is really the budget, right? So clearly, even the central government is aware that the budget is slowly becoming irrelevant. In Part A, there was a lot more talk about achievements before the budget, right? What has happened throughout the year, than what is going to happen in the next year, next financial year, other than the fact that the taxes were reduced. So if people were getting bored of the achievements, that was, sort of sneaked in. Part B of the budget, GST aa gaya, so there's nothing much to do in indirect taxes. Direct taxes have already been said in Part A, but Part B had to be there, so there was some tinkering with customs duties as usual. So, if I look at the entire budget, therefore, it is clearly not the important thing that we are looking for various reasons. One is, of course, that what we need now is a restructuring of the economy, and there is very little the central government can do on that. Much of the restructuring has to come at the state level. When we talk about, for example, health and education, however much we may hope that the central government can do something, it cannot, unless the states gear up. And this is something that we must be talking about every year when the budget comes out. And I know this because, our institution is also part of the so-called 5-institution budget discussion, which happens in Delhi, and IDF is in charge of the social sector, right? So I blame myself also for that we talk about health and education, which obviously are things in the social sector, based on the central budget, and that's really a waste of time and irresponsibility on the part of the intellectual or the economist, because we have to go down to the states with this problem. Health and education, it has to be the states which take up a lot. Of course, the central government can provide money and resources, but where is the state plan? If we look at the state budgets, for example, right, we can start talking about health and education, which we don't. Okay, so having said that, the next point I want to make is that this was indeed an election year budget. Right, so that was obvious. Why? Because it was clearly directed at the people, and it was not directed at business, labor, agriculture, this community, that community, right? It was people. And why do I say people? Rich, taxes reduced. Middle, taxes reduced. Poor, commitment to increase incomes. Okay, because they are not taxpayers in any case. Right? So those three were very clear, and if you start reading the budget with this lens, you will see that all these three have been touched in the budget. What was interesting is that in this budget, I did a word search in the budget speech. I did a word search for the word poor. The word poor. If you look at our earlier budgets, they are all over the place, because in the name of the poor, we were doing everything. In this budget, poor was mentioned only once. And that too, when talking about poor prisoners who could not furnish bail and were hence kept back in prison, or could not pay the meager penalty that was imposed on them and hence were in jail. Other than that, there was no mention of the word poor. So this was an election year budget. New businesses, right, and digitalization. That was the focus. There is a hope in the government that our startup activities is going to generate new income, new jobs. And hence the focus on digitization, hoping that digitalization will follow. And wherever the private sector is unwilling to move in, the government will do so. And hence the talk of digital public infrastructure. Right? Not using that term maybe, but all the health stack, the data stacks that the government is building is essentially to encourage startup businesses. Now, the best, and this example is given all the time, which is UPI. But I would want you to look a little bit closely at the data. In the UPI, unfortunately, more than 80% of all transactions is through Google Pay and Phone Pay, both of which are foreign companies. Right? They are not domestic companies. So how much the new startup activity in India, domestic startups in India, will take, will capitalize on these platforms is not quite clear. The one point I would like to make here is that there is a lot of talk about skilling the youth. And for some strange reason, and this is, I'm sorry to say this, this shows our elitism in our society. For some strange reason, we have decided that education and skill are two different arms, often orthogonal to each other. So you can talk about education without talking about skill, and you can talk on skill without talking about education. Now the fact of the matter is, however poor the data are, if I were to look carefully at the data, people who have had an education, that is whether they're secondary pass or graduate and above, as opposed to those who are not but skilled, the average wage of the educated are much higher than those who are skilled. This is what the data say. and that's why I say we are very elitist.